Venezuela is becoming the new focal point of global politics. In just a few weeks, thousands of citizens in Caracas, from civil servants, housewives to retirees, have voluntarily joined the Bolivarian militias, sending a firm message they are ready to face the pressure from the U.S. Navy offshore. But more worrisome, this crisis is no longer a domestic matter, but is turning into a global strategic chessboard. Is this the opening move for a major confrontation, or just a strategic step to maintain pressure? To understand today's tensions, it is necessary to return to 2017, the first term of President Trump. At that time, the Venezuela crisis had dragged on for years, and Washington began discussing tougher scenarios. Some advisors suggested a military intervention, and on August 11, Trump declared before the press that he did not rule out a military option for Caracas. This statement was immediately condemned by Venezuela's defense minister Vladimir Lopez, calling it extreme and irrational. An important factor in this context was Senator Marco Rubio, who repeatedly called for tough measures against the Maduro government. Rubio's presence in policy discussions showed that Washington was leaning toward a tougher stance on Venezuela. Trump later stressed on Fox News in 2020, "If I wanted to go into Venezuela, I would not keep it secret. I would not send a small group. It would be called the military." Both statements showed that if military action were taken, it would be an open, large-scale campaign, not a covert move. The peak of tension appeared in January 2025, when, just a few days before Trump's second inauguration, President Maduro called for the liberation of Puerto Rico. From a symbolic statement, Puerto Rico suddenly became an official strategic security file in Washington's calculations. Puerto Rico's Governor Jennifer Gonzalez Galán sent a letter to Trump calling it a direct threat to U.S. national security. At the same time, Washington raised the Venezuela issue to the international level by linking it to transnational criminal networks. The Trump administration even declared the Cartel of the Suns a global terrorist organization and directly accused Maduro of being its head. At the same time, the Tren de Aragua gang was also proposed to be added to the terrorist list to legitimize suppression measures, including against the Venezuelan migration flow. These steps showed that Washington had elevated the Venezuela issue from a regional crisis to an international security file. In that context, the Trump administration chose three parallel moves, offering a $50 million bounty for Maduro's prosecution, the same level once applied to Osama bin Laden, expanding the Pentagon's military role in anti-drug operations, and deploying large-scale naval forces off the coast of Venezuela. According to Jane's Defense Weekly in 2025, this force included 3 guided missile destroyers, an amphibious group with about 4,500 sailors, and 22,000 Marines. On paper, this was still described as a counter-narcotics operation, but the scale of the forces made many observers worry about a military intervention scenario. The legal basis for these actions was a secret directive from President Trump allowing the Pentagon to use force against drug gangs classified as terrorists. However, under international law, this was not a legal basis for a full intervention, since the UN Charter only allows self-defense or the consent of the Security Council. In addition, Colombia and Brazil also worried that the U.S. would use the pretext of anti-drugs to intervene in the region. That showed that although the secret directive created an additional deterrent tool, it was not enough to turn the Venezuela invasion scenario into reality in the short term. From a military perspective, it is clear that the U.S. has overwhelming superiority and is fully capable of changing the situation in Venezuela. However, this does not mean a full-scale military campaign. According to RAND Corporation, 2004 report on the Iraq campaign, the scale of a full assault usually requires over 170,000 troops, as in the case of Iraq in 2003. Meanwhile, US forces present off the coast of Venezuela are only in the tens of thousands, not enough to be considered a full-scale invasion campaign. Moreover, Venezuela's terrain, a mix of jungles, mountain ranges, and densely populated urban areas, will increase operational challenges. Politically, Washington is also constrained by the fresh lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan victory on the battlefield. Does not mean long-term stability. An intervention could backfire as Caracas becomes a foothold for Russia and China to expand influence, while Maduro is strengthened as a symbol of resisting outside intervention. At the regional level, the most worrying factor is the domino effect. Colombia, Brazil, and many Latin American countries are cautious since a conflict in Venezuela could trigger a large-scale migration wave. This is not only a humanitarian issue, but also a political economic burden for the entire region, while the ability to coordinate responses remains limited. In addition, Venezuela is not a defense vacuum. According to the CPRI Arms Transfers Database 2023, the country owns air defense systems purchased from Russia, such as S-300 Bukmone and several Ante-2,500 units maintained with Russian experts' support. This is the shield that makes any attack plan risk triggering a response from Moscow. The key point is military power, though important, cannot solve the entire Venezuela equation. The risk of winning the battle but failing to keep the peace always exists, and that is why the possibility of the US choosing a full-scale military solution remains in question. When discussing the next steps, three main scenarios can be envisioned. First is the possibility of a full-scale invasion. In theory, the US has sufficient resources, but in practice, the costs and risks are too great, making this scenario almost unlikely. Lessons from the Middle East show that military victory does not mean long-term stability. Another option is a limited tactical strike, such as targeting critical infrastructure or the operating routes of drug networks. This could be a quick way to create pressure, but it carries significant risks, from the danger of civilian casualties to Caracas exploiting international opinion to appear as the victim of an intervention. In terms of scale, US forces offshore are sufficient to maintain pressure, but not enough to turn it into a full-scale campaign like Iraq in 2003. Finally, and also the scenario most experts consider feasible, is the strategy of non-invasion but maintaining pressure. The US Navy then becomes a bargaining chip, forcing Caracas to compromise on anti-drug cooperation, while also deterring in the Essequibo area of Guyana, an oil-rich region Venezuela has repeatedly claimed sovereignty over. According to International Crisis Group analysis, 2024 Caracas has previously tested gray zone tactics, such as mobilizing gangs and paramilitaries to pressure Guyana, so US presence in the Caribbean is also a warning: do not dare touch Essequibo. From these three scenarios, it is clear that the choice of continuous pressure but avoiding direct confrontation both minimizes risks and helps the US maintain strategic leverage. The remaining question is how far Caracas will react, continue confrontation to show resolve, or gradually accept compromise in a situation where concessions are inevitable. The situation in Venezuela in the coming period will not only depend on military strength, but also lie in political and diplomatic decisions. First, the actions of President Maduro will be an important variable. If he continues to make shocking statements such as liberating Puerto Rico, the risk of escalating tensions will certainly increase. But on the other hand, showing partial goodwill to cooperate with Washington in the issue of counter-narcotics could open an opportunity to ease tensions. In addition, Trump's level of toughness is also a factor that cannot be ignored. In the context of the upcoming election, he needs to demonstrate the image of a determined leader. But at the same time, also consider the reaction from domestic public opinion, where Americans still have many priorities beyond the Venezuela crisis. This is a difficult problem, how to maintain a firm stance without falling into a costly crisis. Finally, the role of Russia and China cannot be overlooked. Both have deep economic and strategic interests in Venezuela, from energy to financial military cooperation. If the US takes strong measures, Moscow and Beijing will likely seek indirect responses, turning Caracas into a secondary front in the global rivalry. That makes any US move require careful calculation, avoiding turning Venezuela into a hotspot difficult to control. Overall, these three factors intertwine and influence each other, creating a complex situation where every small move can lead to major changes in the regional balance. The US-Venezuela confrontation reflects a familiar paradox in international relations. Escalation is always easy, but finding ways to de-escalate is the real challenge. When both sides have their own political motivations to maintain a standoff, the most likely scenario is not full-scale explosion, but prolonged tension. At the global level, international institutions such as the UN Security Council or the European Parliament have repeatedly called for maximum restraint and warned of the risk of a spreading humanitarian crisis. This shows that the international community clearly recognizes the risks but still lacks effective tools to prevent the spiral of escalation. From a practical perspective, there are three prominent lessons. For the US, relying on military power without regional consensus easily creates backlash. For Venezuela, escalating tensions may consolidate domestic legitimacy but becomes a diplomatic burden. As for Latin American countries, dependence on oil and maritime routes means any turmoil in Venezuela can easily trigger a chain effect directly impacting the region's economy and society. In other words, Venezuela is becoming a benchmark to test whether great powers choose the path of confrontation or building cooperative restraint mechanisms. In your view, in a world where power competition takes place not only on the battlefield, but also on the fronts of diplomacy and information, what is the factor that truly determines a nation's position? Military strength, the ability to control data, or the capacity to maintain social trust? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you find this analysis useful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to continue following in-depth content on global politics and current affairs. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video.